Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, members of the committee, thank you very much for this opportunity to testify. I appreciate very much the bipartisan commitment that your committee has shown to investigate Russia's interference in the European elections and in our own elections. There is no doubt about Russia's systematic campaign to undermine our 2016 presidential election, the Montenegrin, Dutch, French, and German elections this year, and Russia is seeking to diminish the confidence that the citizens of all these countries have in their democracies. In this sense, Russia's actions pose an existential threat to the democratic nations of the West, and it requires a swift and serious response by Europeans as well as Americans. You asked for our recommendations, Mr. Chairman, so I have just three. First, the United States and Europe need to work much more closely together to identify Russia's cyber and disinformation attacks as they are being launched, and then we need to work together actually to do something about it, to respond in tandem to discredit Russia's actions. You saw the campaign of Emmanuel Macron do that very effectively. You've not seen that in other countries. We on both sides of the Atlantic should also make it clear to the Russian government that we have our own capabilities that can be injurious to Moscow and that we will use them if Moscow doesn't cease and desist. With this in mind, and with the benefit of hindsight, President Obama, in my own view, should have been more transparent and specific with the American people during the campaign about the nature of the Russian threat. He should have reacted earlier and much more vigorously. Now, to be fair to him, this was an extraordinarily difficult choice. It was a new and unexpected threat. President Obama would have likely been accused in the heat of a campaign for intervening in the contest between Secretary Clinton and Donald Trump, and he did make the right call in the end by imposing sanctions on Moscow. But we in America and Europe have to learn from this experience and try to avoid that in the future. Second, the U.S. and Europe should adopt stronger sanctions against Russia for its actions to weaken our elections. We learned an important lesson in the Iran nuclear negotiations in the Obama and George W. Bush administrations. The sanctions were much more effective when the United States and the EU aligned them together, specifically the financial sanctions. I hope the House of Representatives will back and not dilute, in this sense, the very strong Senate sanctions bill against Moscow that you passed by a 97-2 margin 2 weeks ago. In my view, it would be a great mistake for President Trump to veto such a bill. And with our long national two-century debate about the separation of powers in mind, I do think that Congress, it's time for the Congress, and not the President, to lead the American response to Russia's cyber attack on the United States. The President has shown that he's unwilling to act against Russia, and that is why the congressional view provision in your Senate bill makes eminent sense, so that the administration cannot ease or lift the sanctions on Russia until Putin's attacks on our democratic elections have ceased and until he's met the provisions of the two Minsk agreements on Ukraine and Crimea. Third, Congress and the President must make resistance to Russian interference in the European elections, as well as ours, an urgent national priority. I served in the government for a long time. I served both parties as a Foreign Service officer, and I find it dismaying and objectionable that President Trump continues to deny the undeniable fact that Russia launched a major cyber attack against the United States, regardless of what party he launched it against. He's done the same thing in Europe very systematically, and yet in response to that, President Trump has refused to launch an investigation of his own. He's not made this an issue in our relationship with the Russians. He's taken no steps, at least that I'm aware of, with the Congress and state and local governments to strengthen our voting systems from future Russian hacking of our midterm elections in 2018 and of the next presidential election in 2020. There's no indication he's asked his senior cabinet officials to develop a plan to protect the United States and to deter the Russians. And his failure to act, and I'm a former U.S. ambassador to NATO, or as President George W. Bush's ambassador, we have a political responsibility in NATO to protect each other, not just from armed conventional attacks, but from cyber attacks as well. That's a clear failure. I've worked for both parties. It's inconceivable to me that any of President Trump's predecessors would deny the gravity of such an open attack on our democratic system, I don't believe any previous American president would argue that your own hearings in the Senate are a waste of time, or in the words of President Trump, a witch hunt. They're not. You're doing your duty that the people elected you to do. It is his duty, President Trump's, to be skeptical of Russia. It's his duty to investigate and defend our country against a cyber offensive, because Russia is our most dangerous adversary in the world today. And if he continues to refuse to act, it's a dereliction of the basic duty to defend the country. And Russia's going to do this again. You heard Director Comey at this committee say that he felt that Russia would be back, maybe against the Republican or Democratic Party. Our elections will be at risk when that happens, and the sanctity of our elections will be compromised in the minds of our citizens. Let me just close by saying that Russia's really testing the leadership and resolve of the West. Americans and Europeans are far stronger in our democratic traditions and our values than the Russians, and with this in mind, we need to be more effective in countering them. And we can do that by building bipartisan unity in the Congress, and I do want to commend you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Vice Chairman. You've set a bipartisan tone, which is deeply appreciated. We can do that by encouraging the President to act. We can do that by being very closely aligned with the Europeans to take common action. And I think if we can achieve those three things, we can defeat President Putin and the Russian intelligence services. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you for your service for a long time to this country.